At some point during the last 150 years, the fifth planet of Salmaconli Drama has shattered, forming an asteroid belt. I'd call that geological instability. Is there any indication this is work of an unknown intelligence? This is geology, not malevolence. Those planets live fast and die hard. The question is, why? Come to the coast, we'll get together and have a few laughs. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Pen Pals, of which is episode 15 of season 2 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I cover the second season episode, Pen Pals. So Pen Pals is the episode where Data contacts this girl from a pre-war planet where their civilization is dying off from a natural disaster, and he makes friends with her and thus convinces Picard to violate the Prime Directive in order to save this planet. In the process, Data actually ends up beaming the girl to the Enterprise, much to Picard's dismay. However, Dr. Pulaski manages to erase the girl's memory before returning her to the planet with no memory that the Enterprise has saved the planet and her life, and then the Enterprise goes on their merry way with Data saying even though she won't remember him, he will remember her. So one thing I want to start with this episode. This is another episode. I think this mid part of season 2 is really one of the most forgettable parts of the entire show. There's continuing episodes I haven't seen very much, or don't think about, or don't care much about, particularly Icarus Factor, and then this episode, and there's a few others as well. Now, this wasn't a particularly bad episode, and I will say that up front. It's not like this is a terrible episode, and that's part of the reason why it doesn't stick in my mind. Is because it doesn't stand out one way or the other. Another point that I did want to make about this episode is that I brought up the channel Lore Runner several times, the YouTube channel, because it's a very good channel. He was a very good analyst, I would say, that analyzed all the Star Trek shows, and really I thought his insights were incredibly insightful and very fascinating, and then brought a lot of different sort of understanding to my knowledge of Star Trek. But I bring him up whenever I disagree with him because as much as I love his content, there's sometimes where I disagree with him, and I think this is one of the most poignant times, because he stated the 3 essential Star Trek episodes about the Prime Directive, or at least the 3 essential Next Generation episodes about the Prime Directive were Symbiosis, this one, and Homeward in Season 7. And I very, very, very strongly disagree with that. I actually would not put this episode in an essential Prime Directive episode, and I think he chose this episode in particular as the most essential Prime Directive episode, and had a whole conversation about the Prime Directive in his rumination video on this episode, where I wouldn't even include this episode as an important Prime Directive episode. Instead, and I agree with Symbiosis and Homeward, but instead of this episode, I would put Who Watches the Watchers. And for some reason, he excluded Who Watches the Watchers and didn't even talk about the Prime Directive when other people brought up Who Watches the Watchers as a Prime Directive episode. He's like, I can't remember his exact reasoning, but he says that's not really a Prime Directive episode, which I actually would choose Who Watches the Watchers as the most essential Prime Directive episode in TNG. In fact, I did, because that was one of the first episodes that I reviewed on my channel. In fact, it was the second ever Star Trek review that I did, was Who Watches the Watchers, and I did a huge, long discussion about the Prime Directive in my review of that episode. And I wouldn't even think to talk about Pen Pals as a Prime Directive episode, because that was a very forgettable episode. Now, the reason for this being is that some people look at this episode because there is a scene where the senior staff are debating the merits of the Prime Directive. Should we act or should we not? And the whole episode does seem to hinge on the Prime Directive. However, the reason why I wouldn't even include it in essential viewing for Prime Directive is that I think this episode is not written particularly well. It doesn't handle the topic particularly well, and it's just not a well-written episode, whereas episodes like Who Watches the Watchers, Symbiosis, and Homeward are well-written episodes that, to me, explore the topic of the Prime Directive in a lot more dynamic and complex way. Getting very specific about this episode versus Who Watches the Watchers is that this episode has a philosophical debate about the Prime Directive, but then they essentially just proceed to violate it, save this planet's life, save this little girl's life, and go on their merry way, and there's no consequences. So everything, all the downsides or the purposes of the Prime Directive are all theoretical. We don't actually see anything, any consequences on screen of why the Prime Directive exists, or the consequences of defying the Prime Directive or skirting the Prime Directive. And that's exactly what we get in Who Watches the Watchers, which is why I think that is actually the most essential Prime Directive episode. I'm really confused of why Lore Runner thinks it doesn't even qualify as a as a Prime Directive episode, where I think it's the most essential, because there we see the direct consequences of violating the Prime Directive. We see exactly why the Prime Directive exists, and the whole point of the episode is Picard trying to repair the damage from violating the Prime Directive. And so therefore that's more standout of why exactly that what the consequences of the Prime Directive are, whereas this episode is all theoretical and we don't really see any consequences. They save the day and everything's fine. So that's not really a really good exploration of the Prime Directive, in my humble opinion. Homeward's another good one, because that shows, again, the direct consequences of good and bad. And that episode mostly does with the good, but some bad as well, of what happens when you defy the Prime Directive. And also, in Homeward and Symbiosis, Picard's stance on the Prime Directive is more firm, whereas you get episodes like this and Justice, where his stance on the Prime Directive is more flimsy, which makes his character a bit inconsistent on this topic. And that leads to debates in the Trekkiedom. I've seen different opinions. The overwhelming opinion I've seen, which I think Lore Runner also ascribes to some extent, is anti-Prime Directive. That the Prime Directive should just be taken lightly, and every single specific event or specifics involved, all the circumstances need to be considered. To what extent should the Prime Directive be followed should be completely arbitrary, and something, not arbitrary, but something that is determined by the context and by good judgment, people of good character making smart decisions based on what the specific circumstance is, and that the Prime Directive should not be a hard and fast rule that you must live or die by or follow no matter what. And Star Trek has been kind of inconsistent on which one the prime directive is or how Starfleet sees this. In some cases, Starfleet is shown to see it as a hard and fast live or die rule. In some cases, they're really lenient on it. It's led to joke for some Trekkies to call it the prime suggestion instead of the prime directive, which I do like. But some other Trekkies would make the argument that it should be the prime suggestion and not the prime directive, and that if you're using it as a hard and fast directive rule that you cannot break, that it leads to immorality. It leads to mass death, and sometimes what some people incorrectly classify as genocide, which this is getting into the whole Dear Dr. Enterprise argument, because that objectively is not genocide because they literally did nothing. You need to do something in order to commit genocide. I'm sorry, but you do. Doing nothing is not genocide. But anyway, it's led other people to at least say that is immoral to do nothing and to allow others to die, which is a valid argument. The genocide thing is objectively misuse of language, but to say it is immoral, whether or not I agree with that in the particular circumstance, is a valid argument that many Trekkies or Star Trek fans or whatever they want to be called make. And so the prime directive has become a hotly debated topic for this reason. So getting back to this specific episode and why I don't think it is a very good measure of the prime directive and why I think you should look at other episodes is getting back to my whole issue with season 2. Now, it's obvious to me, and this is the third episode in a row actually that I reviewed for season 2 that has the same problem where it's a good concept of an episode where the concept actually could have been done well, but it seems like a first or second draft. It seems like the script was not fully developed or done correctly, or not enough time was spent on the script. In fact, this is a reoccurring theme I've just started to notice throughout season 2. Now, I'm like really looking forward to reviewing season 3, so I already started doing a lot of research for season 3 of TNG, and it's interesting seeing the contrast of season 2 and season 3 and just how much better season 3 is, because most of the writers in season 3 were the same in season 2. You have particularly towards the end of season 2, the writing staff didn't really change that much going into season 3. And also, I talked a lot in season 2 about how they were rushed. They were working very fast. They were working from behind because of the writer's strike. And they were trying to come up with scripts very fast in season 2. But that also apparently was the same in season 3. I used to have this misnomer that the entire writer's room like calmed down and was more sort of collective and easygoing during season 3, but doing my research for season 3, that's actually not the case. The writer's room apparently was just as chaotic, and they were just as, if not more, rushed in season 3 as they were in season 2. It wasn't until season 4 when things started to calm down and become a more sort of calm, safe environment. So what was the main difference between season 2 and 3? Because there's a huge difference in outcome of the episode results, of the final results. This is very evident to anyone with eyes, and now that I'm going through and analyzing the specific episodes and anticipating, having already reviewed some season 3 episodes, I've reviewed a lot of them, a lot more than I did season 2. I wonder why, because they're more interesting to analyze. But going through and analyzing, with fine detail, as I try to do every single episode of the show, and going through season 2 and comparing that to what I've already done in season 3 and anticipating what I will do further in season 3, there is a noticeable stark difference in the outcome of how much stronger and tighter and just better constructed the stories are in season 3 compared to season 2. And so this is something I'm going to explore more when I get to season 3. I'm going to do a whole video about the writing, actually. The main reason apparently boils down to the showrunner, because that was the major difference between season 2 and 3. As Maurice Hurley was in charge of season 2 and Michael Piller was in charge of season 3, and apparently, and they had, as I said, mostly the same writing staff. They had the same rushed deadlines and the same chaotic atmosphere in the writer's room, but it just appeared to be that Michael Piller was able to manage his team. And of course, a lot of this had to do with Ira Steven Behr as well, because Michael Piller apparently had terrible social skills. But still, regardless, they seem to manage their team and get them to work together and break down the story and correct any mistakes at a much faster pace than they were able to do in season 2. So essentially what it boils down to is the showrunner. And that's not to say that Maurice Hurley was a terrible showrunner. I noted in season 1 how there was an obvious improvement from when Maurice Hurley took over from Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry was obviously even worse as a showrunner. And you do see the improvement from season 2 from, season 1, which is also due to Maurice Hurley. So it's not to say that he was a terrible showrunner, but I think he was a good showrunner for a average show, for like a cop procedural or a hospital drama or like a lawyer show or any normal TV shows. But for a sci-fi show, and especially Star Trek, which had Roddenberry and the Roddenberry box, which I talked about before, it required something more unique than just a good, average, competent showrunner, which is what I think Maurice Hurley was. It required an outstanding think-on-your-feet showrunner, which is what Michael Piller was. And I don't think Maurice Hurley was up to the task, and I think that's extremely apparent, especially comparing season 2 and 3, seeing that was the one major difference in the writing staff was the showrunner. Everything else, all the circumstances, most of the writers were pretty similar from season 2 to 3. And Ira Steven Behr, who was Michael Piller's, second-hand man, was also an important factor as well. We can't discount him, but still, it seems to boil down to, and also Michael Piller just seemed to know how to handle Gene Roddenberry better, because Maurice Hurley is said to often butt heads with Roddenberry, even though they got along for the most part, but there's a lot of specific examples where they're like butt heads, whereas Michael Piller seemed to consider Roddenberry as a challenge rather than a hindrance, which is, again, something I'll get more into in season 3. And so I think that perspective is probably a huge factor in why he was able to do such a better job. So why am I bringing this up now in this episode, Pen Pals? Because as I said, this is the third episode in a row that I covered, from Time Squared, Icarus Factor, and now this, where it's a good concept but not executed well. And that's a common occurrence throughout season 2. That was true about, The Child, I don't know if I'll say it was a good concept, but it definitely wasn't executed well. It was executed absolutely terribly. It could have been done better. And there's other episodes throughout season 2 which are good concepts that could have been done better. I think Q Who is an incredibly overrated episode, which I'm going to get to next week in my Revisited. I already covered that if you want to check out my thoughts on that. And I think Q Who was not done very well, and that could have been done better as well. And I think there's other examples in season 2. But for me, the definitely 3 that really stand out is these 3 episodes in a row: Time Squared, Icarus Factor, and Pen Pal. So with Time Squared, I talked about how that was an interesting, fascinating concept where you have a Picard from the future show up with a harbinger of doom message of a recording saying that you will be killed in 6 hours. That is a very compelling hook. And the way that the episode is executed through production value, particularly acting, music especially, and production design, they do an amazing job of creating this very ominous tone that really hooks the audience and gets them involved. But the problem with that episode is they don't go anywhere with that hook. They don't successfully pull off an interesting storyline. They manage to pull off a very interesting tone and a very effective tone, but they don't. The storyline's very simplistic. All you got to do is go forward and problem solve. And so the script was not there. The concept was there, but they needed way more time. They needed more drafts, and they needed a better script. And again, maybe not even more time, because as I said, in season 3, they didn't have any time, but they still managed to save the scripts, which they couldn't do in season 2 for some reason. And then so you had a decent episode, but it could have been, it didn't anywhere near live up to its potential. And then you have the Icarus factor, which, in my opinion, humble opinion, was a horrid script that was horribly written. Like, the idea behind it, and there were several ideas behind it, and they never coalesced, they were more chaotic, was good. Like, you could have a story about Riker and his estranged father trying to get along. That is inherently not a bad concept. That could be done very well. That could be a interesting concept, and I compared it to the Deep Space Nine episode The Alternate, which dealt with Odo and his estranged father figure, and how that was actually executed really good, whereas the Icarus factor was executed very poorly. And again, Maurice Hurley blamed Roddenberry for this, saying that Roddenberry was interfering with his Roddenberry box too much. But again, that to me sounds like an excuse, like he didn't see it as a challenge the way that Michael Piller would, and instead just saw it as a hindrance. And so the script felt very pointless. There was no point to having this conflict between Riker and his father because it wasn't executed well. It wasn't interesting. It wasn't pulled off well. It didn't achieve any character goals. And it was combined with the storyline with Worf's ascension that really was jarring and did not fit into it. So it was another example of a script not just needing more development and not getting it. Now, the episode Pen Pals falls in between Time Squared and Icarus Factor. It's not as effective as Time Squared, particularly with the tone, but it's not as terrible as the Icarus Factor. It's not as chaotic and terribly written. It's somewhere in between. And the issue with Pen Pals, and the major issue that is, and I've noticed I've watched other reviews that point to this as well, because I think this is the huge factor, is that the whole episode hinges on Data's relationship to the young girl, Shizhenka, whatever her name is. And the episode does a time jump that skips over building the relationship, which is what you need as the foundation of the episode. Therefore, there is no foundation in this episode. There's nothing that hooked on. This is something I've noticed when I very first saw this episode. It's why I never paid much attention to it. It's why this episode didn't really get my attention. Why it was so forgettable for me is because I felt zero attachment to the events that were happening in the second half of the episode, because they failed to get me attached. They failed to establish the relationship between Data and this young girl, which is what the whole episode hinges on. Instead, they waste time on Picard riding his horse and talking about the benefits of horseback riding, and a subplot about Wesley's first command, which is average at best and could have been thrown into any other episode. Where really that time should have been spent on establishing the relationship between Data and this little girl, which is what the whole story hinges on, and why the story falls apart and fails to hold anyone's attention, because they failed to develop this at all. In fact, they specifically did an 8-week, if you're paying attention, there's a little thing in dialogue that points out there was an 8-week time jump from when Data first talks to this young girl, where you hear her say, "Hello, is anyone there?" They jump 8 weeks, and then all of a sudden, Data has this relationship with this young girl that took place entirely off screen. And that right there is 101 bad writing. That is specifically what not to do when writing a episode, especially that hinges on this character story. It's one of the most blatant, worst examples of bad writing, like specific examples that I can nail down specifically that I've seen in The Next Generation so far, if I'm being very honest. And if you compare, like, there's other, and this is the same thing with other episodes I talked about in season 2, like Times Squared. You can compare it to other episodes that Next Generation did later on and see specific examples where they actually did it much better. Like with Times Squared, you can compare it to All Good Things. You can compare it to Cause and Effect. You can compare it to Second Chances, where they take similar themes but actually do them correctly. And it's the same thing here with Pen Pals. Which is why I brought up other episodes like Who Watches the Watchers, which again explored the Prime Directive way better than this episode. But the other episode I would bring up that's an important factor here is, as far as Data making a relationship with the young girl, is the 7th season episode. I'm blanking on the title. The Amnesia episode, which I actually think is a really good episode. I think it is an underrated episode that is done really well, specifically because it establishes, it does what this episode failed to do. It establishes you get why Data has a relationship with this alien young girl. Thine Own Self, that's the name of the episode, sorry. Yes, Thine Own Self. Which I think is a really underrated episode. That's actually one of my favorites of season 7, mainly because of that character story. That is the heart of the episode, because you see that relationship develop. You buy into that relationship. It sells you on the relationship, so you're sold that Data is this father figure to this young girl. And here, this is exactly what it's missing. They skip over it from a time jump. So when you see, at the end of the episode, Data having this relationship with this young girl, and this young girl clinging to him and saying, "Oh, Data, I like you," it is a tell, not show situation. You are being told by the writers that this young girl has developed this relationship with Data, but you were not shown it. Whereas in Thine Own Self, you were shown it. Therefore, you have zero connection with Data. You're just constantly being told, not shown. The writers are like sitting next to you watching the show, being like, no, trust me. She has a good relationship with Data. He's like a father figure to her. Trust me, just go with it. Which is bad writing. Bad writing 101. It's absolutely what not to do when writing the episode. So to me, this is one of the most blunt examples of a poorly written episode. Even though it's, as I said, it's just like Times Squared. It's a really good concept, and which is why I think some people focus on it. And to be fair, the scene in Picard's room where they're debating the Prime Directive is a good scene, but there's no foundation for that scene, which is why it doesn't hold up. Even to the earlier episode, Symbiosis in season 1, which a lot of people like to, criticize season 1. I think that episode, it was much better written than this one. And And then, of course, especially not the later episodes like Who Watches the Watchers and Homeward, which do a much more dynamic and full job of laying out the consequences of the Prime Directive. So, getting back to the Prime Directive, the debate here, as I said, is more philosophical, where Pulaski seems to argue that it's kind of fate, because if fate puts the Enterprise in a situation where it's able to save this alien species, then maybe that's what fate had planned all along. Maybe they planned for the Enterprise to interfere, which is a very philosophical and sort of, I would say, structurist like way of looking at it. And Worf's stance was more of flat out, is this the Prime Directive or Prime Directive or not? Is it the number one Federation Starfleet law or is it not? And if it is, we need to follow it regardless. We can't just willy-nilly decide. In fact, that's Picard makes the argument that the reason why the Prime Directive exists is to take those emotionality out of it and just look at it objectively. And it boils down to, and this is what I think a lot of Star Trek fans who are very anti-Prime Directive miss about the Prime Directive, is that the point of it is to not play God. And in fact, I love how they specifically mention that in this conversation, where I can't remember the exact context, but someone said, "Oh yeah, if we're able to see in the future and see what happens, then we'd know that this is the right thing to do." But then Riker's response to that: "If we were able to do that, we would be gods, and we are not gods, and so we should not. Therefore, we should not be playing God," which was Archer's reasoning back in Dear Doctor, which is a reasoning I 1,000% agree with, by the way, that they're not out there to play God, and that when you look at history and whenever more advanced cultures, no matter how well intentioned, interfere with less advanced cultures, they are essentially being arrogant and saying we know what's right because we're playing God. And so from that perspective, you definitely see the Prime Directive. Now, I think this episode fails to make a case for why it was right for them to interfere in this specific case, which again, I think the episode Homeward does a lot better, because in Homeward you have two opposing viewpoints. You got Picard and you got Rozhenko, I can't remember his name. It's not Sergio Rozhenko, is it? I can't. No, that's his father. I can't remember his brother's name. But the Worf's foster brother. You have those two opposing points of view, where Picard is physically, we should not play God, even if it means the entire race dies. That's not for us to decide. And the other guy is saying that this is cruel and immoral to just sit there and do nothing when you could save their lives. And so you had those two viewpoints, and mostly they lean towards the Rozhenko viewpoint in that particular episode, but you do also see the fallbacks. You see the ill effects of, which is why I love that episode. That, again, that's another underrated episode. I love Season 7, by the way. I think there's a lot of underrated episodes in Season 7. There are a lot of terrible ones, too, to be fair, but there's a lot of episodes that people sleep on or don't like, or I've seen a lot of people not like that episode, and I disagree with the reasonings for it. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. The point is to bring up that episode is to illustrate how it handles this situation so much better than this episode does, because in this episode, what it boils down to, it doesn't come to a decision on whether or not it's morally correct to save these people's lives, or if it's objectively incorrect to do it. What it boils down to is Picard makes the decision to let the people die, to stand by the Prime Directive, and then when Data goes to call the girl and cut off contact, he orders Data, cut off all contact, stop talking to her, and he goes to do it, and everyone in that room can hear the girl calling out, saying, Data, where are you? Data, why aren't you listening to me? And that breaks their heart, and Picard's just like, stop, I can't do it. I can't do it. We're going to have to interfere. And honestly, I think that's a bad reason. I don't think that is a good reason to defy the Prime Directive. I think Rozhenko's reasoning in Homeward was way better. Although he was married to one of the aliens there, so he was also emotionally involved with someone specifically. But he was looking at it more of a wild, way of saying these are beautiful people that we can't let die. In this case, it's simply Picard hearing a young girl call for help and just being unable to ignore it. Which to me seems more like a personal emotional weakness and not a very good reasoning for violating the Prime Directive. Now, I'm not saying I disagree with what they did in this episode. I know a lot of the Prime Directive haters would hate on me for saying that. Oh, you're so immoral. You just want these people to die for no good reason. Which, again, I would get back to the argument of playing God, which I think is a relevant argument. But I ultimately would side with what Picard did. I think they did do the right thing by saving these people, but for the wrong reasons. I think the reasons should have been more complex and holistic rather than simply, I hear a young girl calling for help, and so I just want to save this one girl's life. And incidentally, I will end up saving an entire race of people, but that's kind of incidental. That's just a side effect of me wanting to save this one girl's life. And why do I want to save one girl's life? Is because Data happened to make friends with her. Data's my friend, and he made friends with her, and he's attached to her, therefore I can't let her die. So you see my issue with this, and this gets back, and I had this issue with Voyager and other such things, is that this comes down to personal emotional attachment. This comes down to favoritism, basically, is that they're not doing the right thing because it's morally correct. They're doing the right thing because they have a favoritism. They have a friend who's in trouble, a friend of a friend who's in trouble, and can't turn them away because I like that friend likes the other friend, and so I want to be a friend to my friend, so I'm going to save an entire a race of people who would have died, who I wouldn't have given a shit about earlier, but I just so happen to care about them because I have a friend of a friend. That's a bad reason. I'm sorry, that is a bad reason, and that really bothered me about this episode. Now, getting back to Riker's argument about playing God is, and I like how Picard does take this to the next step when he says, okay, so this is a natural geological disaster, so it's very simple. We come in, we save it, and we stop it. But what if it was a war? What if it was more complex than that? Do we side with the war? Do we help one person fight the war? Then it becomes a lot more of a situation. And he also mentioned a virus that apparently a lot of people have no compunction about interfering with viruses, as we see Dear Doctor, with everyone saying it's genocide not to interfere, which is, again, objectively incorrect, but misuse of language. Whether it's morally correct is another topic, but again. Anyway, but the point is with the not playing gods thing is that Starfleet's job then? Do Starfleet actively travel throughout the galaxy seeking out situations where there's a race of people about to die and purposely go there to save them and prevent the death from happening, regardless of whether it's war, volcanoes, viruses, or what have you? They're the police of the universe, and their whole purpose is to go out and save everyone. Which, to me, it seems like these Prime Directive opponents is what they're proposing. It's what they think Starfleet should be doing. They think it's Starfleet's job to police the universe and to save everyone's lives. And I am against that. And I think that is exactly why the Prime Directive exists. Because that is not Starfleet's job. Because Starfleet are not gods. It's not their job to go out and save everyone in the universe. Now, the argument to that is that I'm taking it to the extreme. Like, you don't have to actively go out and try to save everyone's lives. But if you happen to come across a race of people who are about to die and you could do something, it is immoral to do nothing. But the problem with that line of thought is that then it's still arbitrary, in my opinion. The reason why you should do something is because you just so happen to be there. What if you're not there? Well, fuck those people. I'm not over there. I'm here. So, too bad for those people. They're fucked because I just happen to not be there. I just happen to be here. So I should do something. And again, this is where we get into the philosophicalness, which this episode vaguely touches on. But as I said, it doesn't do a good enough job. It doesn't explore these concepts, which is how I'm looking at it, which is and by the way, I haven't mentioned where I ultimately stand on the Prime Directive. And where I do stand on it is that it should not be a firm live or die rule like that some people present it as, like the way Worf was presenting it as. I think that is immoral. So I do agree with the Prime Directive opponents. In that case, I think it is something that should be it's like they said in justice, like no law should be absolute. And they were talking specifically about the Prime Directive in that case. And by the way, I agree with Picard violating the Prime Directive in that case as well. I think he absolutely did the right thing, and therefore law should not be, and that was the whole moral of that episode, was that law should not be absolute, which is why I like that episode more than a lot of other people, because I think that is a very strong message that I totally agree with. But at the same time, the Prime Directive should exist and does exist for a reason. I think calling it the Prime Suggestion is a bit unfair. But yeah, it should exist it should exist, and it does exist for a reason. And but it shouldn't be absolute. It should be taking into context. What is the context of this situation? Is this the right thing to do? And in some cases, it's not. Like, I think Dear Doctor, I'm sorry, people will disagree with me, but I think that was a clear-cut case where it was not up to Archer and Phlox to play God. They did not commit genocide by doing nothing. They let happen whatever would let happen because they are not gods. And so I think in that case, it was clearly the right thing to do was to do nothing, even if it meant people dying, because it's not up to them. It's not up to Starfleet to go around the universe saving everyone's lives. They are not gods. They would be arrogant to think they were, and I think they would do more harm than good by doing that. But there are other cases, such as this one and Homeward, where saving the people is actually the right thing to do. Because they are already, again, this gets my argument of already being there, but they are in a position. And you have to factor the consequences of action versus inaction. And in these cases, the consequences of inaction is negligible compared to the consequences. I mean, the consequences of action is negligible. Like, they're very few. I mean, there could always be unforeseen consequences, butterfly effect and whatnot, but you got to use good judgment. And in this case, and in the case of Homeward, I think the right thing to do is saving people is obviously there are way more benefits and less repercussions than doing nothing. So I think it should be a case-by-case basis. Whereas I think the Dear Doctor situation was way more complex. And also the symbiosis situation, which I could get into. And so I think it should be a case-by-case basis. I think the Prime Directive should be the Prime Directive, but it should not be absolute. It should, and it's more than a suggestion. I think it's unfair to call it a suggestion, but it shouldn't be absolute. Absolutely should not be. Absolutely should not be absolute. And it should be violated when necessary. So, in other words, I think the way most Starfleet captains handle the Prime Directive is correct. Take it seriously. Don't go willy-nilly. Don't ignore it the way Kirk has done a couple times. Definitely take it seriously. But don't see it as absolute. Don't see it as a hard and die, fast, you must do it or else rule, because sometimes it's worth being violated. And I think... and I think that was clearly the case here, but I think other episodes like Homeward and Who Watches the Watchers did a much better job of exploring that than this episode, because it was not written very well. But speaking of Who Watches the Watchers, that was actually, this episode was referenced in that episode where Dr. Crusher had to erase that guy's memory, and she said she was familiar with Dr. Pulaski's method but wasn't quite sure how to use it, and apparently didn't do a good enough job, and that guy ended up regaining his memory. So that kind of implies that Dr. Pulaski's a better doctor, and I don't like that implication. Of course, that was done just for plot purposes because they wanted the guy to regain his memories. And it's funny that that's how Dr. Crusher stated it, because in this episode, Pulaski states it matter-of-factly, like, oh yeah, it should be an easy thing. But really, it shouldn't. This is an alien race that they never met before. It shouldn't be that easy to erase the memory. So Who Watches the Watchers try to make up for it by saying, oh, Dr. Pulaski's just awesome. And I don't buy that explanation. I think that's bullshit. But they were just trying to cover for the plot hole in this episode, basically. And as cute as it was to have that, that girl holding Data's hand and everything, like, again, none of that was earned, so I didn't really quite buy it. And also the way Data behaved in this episode, I think was very out of character for him. The fact that, so when he heard the girl call and he, she says, anyone out there? And he responded, yes. I think that's out of character for Data, because that seems to imply, like, if it was any other character, like a human character or another emotional alien character, they would do that out of a sense of wanting to respond to a young girl, of hearing a little girl's voice and being emotionally touched by it and being like, well, I can't just ignore her, the way Picard acted later in this episode, which that wouldn't happen for Data. Now, I talked before about how I like when they explore human elements of Data. And I think there are a lot of good examples, particularly in later seasons, when they do that and when they make it work, when he still behaves as an android but has human elements that are interpreted through his android way, like the episode The Offspring is a really good example of that, where he still is an emotionless android, but he still loves his own daughter, but in his own android way, where this is different. This is just him acting like a human when he shouldn't. His behavior of answering her, I think, is out of character for him. And then on top of that, he has we have the 8-week time jump, which is a huge flaw in this script. And during those 8 weeks, he was talking to her, gaining a relationship, building a relationship with her the whole time, and told no one. Now, this harkens back to A Matter of Honor, the episode that was just aired a few weeks before this one, where Picard chastised that Benzite guy because he found out something important and refused to report it to a superior immediately. And Data is doing the exact same thing here. He found out this young girl who is dying, and he started talking to her, and who did he report this to? No one. He went 8 weeks before he finally fessed up and told Picard about it. That is completely and utterly out of character for Data. I do not buy for a single second that Data would do this. And on top of that, you have these dialogue scenes later on between Data and Riker, where Data is, again, he's acting impulsively. He's acting like a really emotional human being by saying, no, I gotta go down there and I gotta tell her she's in danger. And Riker's response to that is, come on, Data. Like, that's his only response. It wasn't like, Data, we shouldn't be doing this. And this is the only time I've actually seen Riker or anyone like a Starfleet superior shoot down, especially a friend, and not even like a young ensign, but the second in command, shot him down by simply saying, oh, come on. What? That's not an argument. You don't just say, oh, come on. You say... I mean, what is he, like a fucking, like, a comedian? Like, oh, come on, what's the deal? Like, why? He's a freaking first officer. Command, he wouldn't just say, oh, come on. He would say, no, Data, this is not the right thing to do. It's not right procedure. And that's really talking down to Data as well. And something that I think was totally out of character. For Riker to do. And Data, as I said it himself, is also acting out of character. Now, he ignores Riker being a dick and instead continues and is just like, oh, but, what's the difference between me sending the message to her or going there in person and delivering the message? And Riker's response, again, he's still being a dick. But at least he's being more specific and not just saying, oh, come on. But his response is to say, a whopping big one, and you know it. Again, he's that condescension level of, and you know it, to Data is so out of character. I think it defies the friendship that Data and Riker has built, especially if you look back, again, just a few episodes to... The Measure of a Man, where Data was like so magnanimous towards Riker and Riker was so forgiving. It's like, I respect you and I love you and you're such a great person. To all of a sudden, oh, come on, Data, stop being a fucking moron. You're being a moron and you know it. I'm sorry, I don't think the circumstances of this episode at all in the least bit justify Riker's behavior here. And then there's, okay, so... Picard's behavior does harken back to season 1 of his whole thing about hating kids being on the bridge. So it is kind of consistent with that, but that's something that I think the show has slowly moved away from just a little bit. It will move away from this a lot more greatly in later seasons, to be fair. At this stage, it hasn't moved that far away, but it still has, like incremental. And so when he reacted the way he did when Data brought the young girl on the bridge, where he was like, Data, he brought a child on my bridge! Oh my god, what the fuck is this guy doing? Why did he bring a kid? You see what it did to this little girl right there? What the fuck? That was out of character for Picard. I'm sorry, I know it does kind of harken back again to the pilot episode, but I think this is beyond that. Now, you might argue there was the added touch of the fact that Data is flagrantly violating the Prime Directive in this case. But I still think that is the incorrect reaction to have. Like, he doesn't even address Data. He goes to Riker and is like, "Did you see that? Did you see that? He brought a child! He brought a child! What the hell?" Which is totally out of character for Picard. He's being a total dick in this situation. And also, this episode's just written so badly. I'm sorry. And also where Troy keeps pressuring the girl to come. She's like, come with me. It's okay. Come with me. It's okay. And it's obvious that this little girl does not want to go with Troy. Troy, who's supposed to be a professional, a counselor who's supposed to sense emotions and can tell that this girl is terrified of her and doesn't want to go with her, and yet her professional reaction is to keep pressuring her when she clearly doesn't want to go. In fact, Troy should be smart enough to be like, go to Picard and be like, look, I need Data to come with me. She's never going to come with me without Data. This isn't working. Or say to Data, like, look, can you help me? Or try a different tact. Not just to keep going, come with me, when clearly it's to the point where the girl even says, like, leave me alone, okay? That is totally out of character. Completely 100% out of character for Troy to do that. So Data was being totally out of character. Riker was being totally out of character. Picard was being totally out of character. Now you have Troy being totally out of character. This is a very poorly written episode. Like, they did not like study any of the character traits of any of them. Now, it did get better when Data took the girl to Pulaski, and Pulaski's being really nice, so she's kind of being out of character too for being nice, because usually she's the rude one. But anyway, she's nice to the girl. They should give her this little feeling stone, and Data breaks the Prime Directive again by leaving it with her on the planet, where she's going to wake up with no memory of what happened but this weird stone in her hand. And again, that's out of character for Data. That's very sentimental, and I don't buy it. And then at the end of the episode, you have this nice scene with Data and Picard, where Picard's telling Data, it's okay, even though I was being a dick to you the whole time. It's fine. You're my friend. I'll do what you like. But Data's response is, I know that she won't remember me, but I will remember her. And that sounds like a good line. And it would have been a good line if it was in any way, sense, shape, or form earned, which it, unfortunately, as I talked about, was not. And so it feels like you connected. It feels like your brain is saying this should be an emotional line. I should feel some emotion and some reaction from Data saying, oh my God, we have to erase her memory. She won't remember me, but I will remember her. But you don't. You don't have an emotional response. You don't feel that power because it was not earned. They did not earn that moment at all. They're trying, again, it's the writers trying to force stuff upon you that they did not earn. So let me quickly address the Wesley side plot. Again, this kind of diverted from the episode. It should have been in a different episode. Like, I don't think it was terrible. It was I didn't see it as pointless. So I've read, some other reviews. People thought it was pointless. I thought it was a learning curve for Wesley, like in someone who was older and more experienced, and I understood his trepidation of giving orders to people who were older and more experienced than him, and Riker having to talk him through it. They actually did something similar with Boimler in Lower Deck Season 4, where he was giving orders it felt uncomfortable giving orders to his peers, who were his peers, but then he got promoted above them. So it reminded me of that, which is cool. It's a good concept. And it was interesting when the guy was just trying to be helpful and be like, look, I think this might be a waste of time. And, I don't think he was being condescending to Wesley at all. He wasn't being like, oh, you're just a kid. You don't know what you're doing. I didn't get that edge at all. I was just got him like literally believing that, we don't really necessarily need to do this, and telling Wesley that. And Wesley let himself be doubted because of that. Which was a bad leadership move, which makes sense for Wesley since he had no experience being a leader. And then after Riker gave him the prep talk, he went back to the guy and was like, look, I want you to run a scan. And he was very definitive, gave an order, didn't doubt himself. He's like, run that scan. And the guy's like, you got it. And I've heard someone say, oh, that doesn't make sense. It would have been better if the guy argued with Wesley or whatever, but I disagree. I think that actually made perfect sense because the guy wasn't trying to be a dick. You don't need to always create conflict. The point of the scene was the fact that Wesley needs to be more assertive and more decisive in his command, his function as a commanding officer, which is exactly what happened. Because the first time he was being unsure, he's like, oh, I don't know, I guess if you say so, I suppose we don't want to do it. When really he told Riker later on, he actually did want to do it, but he was just too unsure of himself to state that. So when he went back and he did state it, definitively, no, just do it. The guy's like, cool, no worries. And I actually like that. I think that made sense. And then, of course, Wesley was vindicated. He ends up saving the day because he gave that order. That's, Wesley being a Mary Sue again, which I'm not happy with, but whatever. But yeah, I think it was okay. It's just the whole plot really distracted from the episode, and it wasn't necessary. And seeing how this episode should have spent more time on Data's relationship with the girl than it makes this subplot in retrospect seem like a waste of time. Or like should have just been another episode. That the episode needed to be more focused on the Prime Directive and on the Data's relationship with the young girl, both of things which they did not adequately spend enough time on. And I suppose the subplot with, as I said, the Picard riding horses thing was probably more expendable, actually. If they wanted to keep the Wesley stuff, they needed to get rid of the horse stuff. That was a complete and utter waste of time. And that was just filler, when that time in the script was needed for the other stuff, and they wasted it on this bullshit instead. So, I would like to thank those who support me on Patreon. It's very much appreciated. Helps the channel continue, helps the channel grow. Very thankful for all those that support me on Patreon. So give a quick shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manijester, Joel Viles, Alessandro Miguelasio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howes. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So there's a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, "Who would have thought Data may be acting like Mariner a bit? He should know as an android that communicating with a non-warp alien as he did was already a violation of the Prime Directive. This wasn't a duck blind, so I guess this shows Data did not care or disregarded. I guess Jellicoe did not study this report when he thought he'd have the most loyal first officer with him. Given that, it does lead to one of the best pro-con discussions about the Prime Directive, and I doubt if pressed about Picard's violations against the Prime Directive, Admiral Satie would likely be on the losing side of this one. But still, an interesting Prime Directive episode. The Wesley story, sigh, necessary, but he hasn't been accepted into the academy yet, and putting him in charge, most internships do not work that way. I'll give it 7 escapes from volcanic doom out of 10. Yeah, alright, so here's the thing about this though, is that Data acting like Mariner is something I don't buy. I just don't buy it. And he is being, and as I said, I just think he's written out of character. And one thing I noticed, and this is something I remember noticing when I very first saw this episode decades ago, and I noticed it again. It seems like Data has longer hair in this episode. You ever notice that? Just look at his hair. It looks a bit longer than normal. I wonder if he's growing like a mullet. Anyway. So next comment is from Ricky, who says, "This was an average episode to me. It's right in between overall of season 2. But the one thing that pisses me off is that in the teaser we see Data make contact with the girl alien, and then after the main credits, all of a sudden Data has been in contact with this girl for a while, and to me that takes away so much of that relationship. This is a clear example of tell not show done in a very bad way. I believe the episode would have been better had we have seen the earlier communication established between Data and the girl, but as for this episode, it was decent, and I did like the concept of Data being friends with the girl and saving her life. It was an okay episode, but could have been done better, like I said. My rating is a 5 out of 10. And of course, Ricky's bringing up exactly what I've been bringing up all video, which makes sense because I think more people would notice this, because I agree this was an obvious flaw. It was it was such a flaw that sticks out, and I have no idea why they did that. Why they just literally jumped straight over Data building the relationship with the girl. And Ricky's right, you lose so much from this episode. It was impossible for me to really connect with this relationship since they just decided to gloss right over it. I think it does hurt the episode a bit more. I think it really damages this episode irreparably by doing that. So my rating for Pen Pals out of 10 is going to be a 4. Poor. You know, when I first started recording this review, I thought I'd give this episode a 5, but this is one of the times where I talked myself down on the rating, because there are aspects of this episode I liked. Like, I like the conversation about the Prime Directive, the philosophical conversation about the Prime Directive. I like what they were trying to do with Data and the young girl and him getting connected to her, but they actually, the more I talk about it, the more I realize that they actually failed to accomplish that. Like, I liked the concept. The concept was good. The execution was terrible. And just also, especially getting out some of the other details, such as how out of character they had a lot of the characters acting. Riker, Data, Picard, Troy, they really fumbled their characters totally. And they were behaving, especially Riker being a dick to Data. That's like unforgivable. I think they're being completely out of character. And so I think a 4 is actually being kind of generous, considering how terribly written this episode was. I think this is a clear case of bad writing, and this script needed way more drafts in order to get it good. I think they had, as I said, they had a good concept, they had a good idea, and some of it was executed well. Some of it. But they just fumbled way too much of it. Like, they needed way more passes at it to get it right. And the ideas sound, it's an interesting look at the Prime Directive. It had me thinking, had my philosophical juices flowing and examining the Prime Directive, which is what you want from an episode like this. But it didn't set out to accomplish what it hoped to. It didn't, as I said, other episodes did this way better. Who Watches the Watchers and Homeward handle the topic of the Prime Directive far superior, examine the ins and outs in the way this episode didn't. And it explored the relationship Data could have with the young girl way better in the episode Thine Own Self than this episode did. So this is yet another example of the bad writing of season 2. So yeah, I think a 4 is being very fair to this episode, because there were aspects of it I did like, but ultimately it is a very poorly written episode, and that's part of the reason why I simply forget this episode exists. It's like a mind erasure thing, just like Pulaski's method. The fact that it was just so ordinary and does not stand out. So anyway, that is it for my review of Pen Pals. Now, just to check what's coming up on the schedule next for my channel. Tomorrow I'll be over on Patreon releasing my revisited video for Q-Who. So revisit my review for Q-Who over for my Patreon supporters. And then on Saturday I'll be back on my main channel with a new public video for Samaritan Snare review, and then on Monday another brand new review public on my channel, Up the Long Ladder. And then on next Wednesday, I will be back over on Patreon for another revisited, this time revisiting Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. If you didn't remember, I was going in release date order for the entire franchise, and Star Trek V came out around this time. So I already did my review for Star Trek V, but I will be revisiting that for my Patreon supporters next Wednesday. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check out that. And also I cover many more videos on Star Trek and many more videos of many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.